They documented their own destruction and still, no one stopped it. What happened to the Franklin expedition is not just a story of disappearance. It is a record of cascading human decisions, ignored warnings, falsified confidence, and institutional blindness that turned a planned naval mission into one of the largest mass deaths in Arctic exploration, followed by decades of denial about what the evidence actually showed. The expedition's victims were not anonymous adventurers. They were officers and sailors operating under formal naval command, governed by written orders, regulations, and expectations. Their deaths were not mysterious acts of nature alone. They were the outcome of choices made before departure, reinforced by rigid hierarchy, and sustained long after survival was no longer possible. The British Admiralty approved the mission with near total confidence. The ships were reinforced, heavily provisioned, and crewed by men considered among the most capable in the Royal Navy, but the very systems designed to ensure success, strict discipline, technological optimism, and centralized command became fatal liabilities once reality diverged from expectation. The expedition consisted of two bomb vessels refitted for polar exploration, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Both ships had already served in extreme environments. Their hulls were strengthened with iron plating, steam engines scavenged from railway, locomotives were installed to provide auxiliary propulsion, heating systems were added to circulate warm air below deck. The ships carried 3 years' worth of food, by official accounting, far exceeding the estimated duration of the mission. Yet from the outset, the expedition carried hidden vulnerabilities. The food supply relied heavily on newly industrialized canned provisions. Over 8,000 tins produced rapidly by a single contractor under minimal inspection. The cans were sealed with lead-based solder, often applied sloppily, leaving excess lead inside. At the time, lead poisoning was poorly understood and not considered a meaningful risk. The crew numbered 129 men. Command rested with Sir John Franklin, a respected officer with prior Arctic experience, but also a history of expeditions marked by starvation and death. His earlier overland journey had resulted in fatalities so severe that contemporaries referred to it as the expedition of death. Despite this, Franklin was granted near total authority over the mission. Once the ships entered the Arctic, communication with the outside world ceased entirely. There would be no updates, no course corrections, no relief unless the expedition returned or failed to do so 4 years. That isolation magnified every decision made on board. The last confirmed European sighting of the expedition showed the ships proceeding confidently into ice-choked waters, still fully manned, still operational. What followed can only be reconstructed from fragmentary written records, Inuit testimony, and physical evidence recovered decades later. The expedition became trapped in pack ice for the first winter. That was not unexpected. Arctic expeditions routinely overwintered. What mattered was what happened next. They became trapped again, and then they failed to escape a third time. The ships remained immobilized for more than a year, locked in ice that did not break up as anticipated. During this time, the crew remained aboard, following naval protocol. There is no evidence of an early, decisive attempt to abandon the ships while men were still relatively healthy. The official record left behind a single handwritten note, later amended, states that Sir John Franklin died during this period. No cause was given. Command passed to Captain Francis Crozier. By the time leadership changed, the expedition had already crossed a point of no return. The same note records that 24 men had died before the ships were abandoned. Again, no causes listed, no breakdown, no acknowledgement of systemic failure, just numbers. When the decision was finally made to abandon the ships, it defied survival logic. Instead of attempting to live off the land or integrate Inuit survival methods, the remaining crew attempted a forced march south, hauling lifeboats and supplies across ice and tundra. They carried silverware, they carried books, they carried heavy personal effects that had no survival value. They did not carry sufficient fresh food. This evidence was initially dismissed or minimized by British authorities. Inuit testimony describing starving white men, some cutting flesh from corpses, was regarded as unreliable or exaggerated. Victorian Britain refused to accept that Royal Navy sailors could descend to such acts, but the physical evidence did not disappear. Skeletons recovered, more than a century later, showed elevated lead levels far above normal exposure. The source was consistent with prolonged consumption of contaminated canned food. Lead poisoning would have caused cognitive impairment, gastrointestinal distress, weakness, and poor judgment symptoms that aligned disturbingly well with the expedition's recorded behavior. The ships themselves remained lost for over 150 years. Their eventual discovery confirmed that they were abandoned intact, not destroyed by ice. This undermines earlier assumptions that sudden catastrophe forced the crew out. Instead, the abandonment appears deliberate and fatally late. No evidence has ever been found of a final, coherent survival plan. No clear division of roles, no adaptation to indigenous knowledge, no staged movement toward known hunting grounds. The investigation into the expedition's fate was prolonged, politically charged, and often dishonest. Search expeditions were launched not solely to rescue survivors, but to protect national prestige. Reports that contradicted the heroic narrative were quietly sidelined. When artifacts began to surface, bones, utensils, personal items, the interpretation was filtered through a lens of denial. Cannibalism was reframed as disturbing possibility rather than accepted fact. Lead poisoning was ignored until modern forensic science made denial untenable. Responsibility remains diffuse but unavoidable. The Admiralty approved and tested food technology. Inspection standards failed. Leadership culture discouraged flexibility. Franklin himself had authority to alter plans, but historical precedent suggests he did not do so even as conditions deteriorated. Captain Crozier, who assumed command after Franklin's death, had more Arctic experience than Franklin, but by the time he took over, the men were likely already compromised by malnutrition and poisoning. His final decisions reflect desperation constrained by training rather than ignorance. No individual was ever formally blamed. No institutional reforms were publicly linked to the disaster at the time. Instead, the narrative was reshaped into one of noble sacrifice and tragic mystery. But the mystery is narrower than it appears. The expedition did not vanish suddenly. It declined slowly, predictably, and visibly to those within it. Warning signs accumulated: prolonged ice entrapment, unexplained deaths, declining physical capacity, irrational logistical choices. Yet protocol held. The men trusted systems that were failing them. Even after the ships were found in modern times, some questions remain unresolved. Why did no group break off earlier to seek help? Why were survival techniques observed by Inuit communities not adopted? Why did the official record omit causes of death entirely? These gaps point not to lost information, but to deliberate omissions. What was written was controlled. What was preserved reflected what leadership wanted remembered. The Franklin expedition is often framed as an exploration tragedy. In reality, it functions more accurately as a case study in institutional failure under extreme conditions, where obedience replaced adaptation and technological confidence replaced empirical caution. The men did not die because the Arctic was unknowable. Indigenous populations thrived there. They died because the system they served could not imagine learning from those it considered inferior, nor could it accept deviation from command structures even when survival demanded it. The evidence does not suggest madness. It suggests impairment. It suggests men attempting to act rationally while their bodies and minds were being systematically poisoned. The final marches, the abandoned ships, the butchered bones, all of it aligns with a slow erosion of capacity rather than sudden chaos. What makes the case unsettling is not that the expedition failed. It is that its failure was documented, recoverable, and still misrepresented for generations. Even now, popular retellings soften the responsibility. The ice becomes the villain, fate becomes the explanation, but the facts point elsewhere. They planned carefully. They prepared extensively. They followed orders precisely. And that is why none of them survived. The Franklin expedition remains unresolved, not because evidence is missing, but because its implications are uncomfortable. It challenges the assumption that discipline guarantees safety, that hierarchy ensures competence, and that technology can replace adaptability. The men were lost, but the truth was never missing. It was simply ignored.